Hi, my name is Rosie Gully, and I'm the local community organizer for the Green Team Nevada for Congressional Districts 3 and 4. The Green Team is a joint project between the Environmental Defense Action Fund and the Natural Resources Defense Council Action Fund, working to build support for climate action and provide our members of Congress the public support they need to be leaders on protecting the environment, advancing clean energy, and fighting climate change. We're working in these districts to engage with climate activists and support the NRDC Action Fund and EDF Action, providing opportunities to advocate for 100% clean energy future through a grassroots movement and participating in activities like town halls, phone banks, and petitions. If you can go ahead and sign our petition to ask Congress to invest in a clean energy future at edfaction.org/green team. And if you're interested in learning more and getting involved with the Green Team, please go ahead and feel free to email me at rosie@greenteam.org.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maria. I'm the state coordinator for Mi Familia Vota here in Nevada. Our mission at Mi Familia Vota is we're a national civic engagement organization that unites Latinos to fight for climate justice with immigrant and allied communities, to promote social and economic justice through citizenship workshops, voter registration, voter participation. Mi Familia Vota currently has operations in Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Nevada, and Texas. MFE Nevada has helped a lot of eligible permanent residents to become citizens, as well as registered eligible voters throughout the fiscal year of 2019. And we have also hosted multiple town halls, lobby days, and events to advocate year-round that affect our community in the fields of immigration, voting rights, environment, worker rights, education, and healthcare.
Menendez, a fellow at the UNLV Immigration Clinic, and will be speaking on climate immigration issues specific to climate refugees. And finally, we are excited to be joined by State Senator Yvanna D from District 10, and she is a co-majority whip who will speak about our state and how they're preparing to handle issues unique to climate refugees. Now, we welcome Guillermo to begin the town hall and introduce himself and take it away.
Much, Brianna. My name is Guillermo. To those that don't know me, I am the Civic Engagement Director for Chispa Nevada, an organization that works for social equity, climate justice, and of course, my division itself is for education for voters, and of course, potential voters to become responsible citizens. I'll be sharing a little bit of my story. Originally, I am from El Salvador, Central America. When I was growing up, I was born literally at the end of our Civil War that went on from 1979 to 1992. So part of my childhood was growing up in that ambience of like the post-war environment, dealing with the repercussions of left behind war material, vendettas, and all things of those sorts that were going on in the nation as it was moving forward into the 21st century, until you started noticing a few different patterns when the rise of the gang violence started in the late 1990s, when deportees were being sent over from Los Angeles and other places during the Clinton administration. And of course, one of our major events that was going on at the time was one of those El Nino cycles in the climate, which sort of was, causes a lot of drought and things of the sort in the area, which Dr. Giovanni will explain a little more. And of course, one of those first events that I really witnessed in my childhood was Hurricane Mitch in 1998. Hurricane Mitch, of course, devastated a lot more of Nicaragua and, of course, Honduras, and that span that it hit Central America. But El Salvador still got hit, and we suffered a lot of damages, and a lot of people, especially in the rural sides of the country, faced different odds, and some people really did leave the country. The one event that I did have to face that sort of led me to leaving the country back was in 2001. In 2001, we got ravaged by a series of earthquakes, really terrible earthquakes that were felt all across Central America, and that displaced so much of the population at the time. And with the lack of opportunity and uncertainty that was, August of 2002, I first came to the United States. When I first came to the United States, I started off in Los Angeles. I started trying to apply for anything that was available. In this case, was the TPS that was already open to people. However, the people that we're working with, we didn't know that something was off in the way how they were filing our paperwork. So in around the time that 2003 came about, my brother and I, we finally received our permit cards. However, we noticed that they were requiring information for that we were not that we were here for a time period that we didn't enter the United States, that we were entered here in 2001. When we figured this, when we tried to confront this, that's when we discovered that we were played a bad hand by the people that the lawyers that supposedly were supposed to help us didn't. So unfortunately, the case fell into limbo, and we eventually moved here to Las Vegas. And some different legal counsel, of course, suggested that if Congress didn't act, the good way was to try to join the military. So during my high school years, I was in a Naval ROTC unit, and just getting ready to eventually make the leap and to try to join military service. Comes my senior year, and was missing a work permit or any other piece of documentation that would sort of describe my case here in the U.S. for them to even consider me joining the services. So that was a rough moment for me, because many of our friends went on to fight in or wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So me being left behind with dealing with that, spent years figuring out other solutions until 2012 election came around, and that's when President Obama did his establishment of the DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. With that one, thankfully, the people that I ended up working with, that I still work with now to this day, on my paperwork, they managed to present all the evidence the real evidence that I have here, that that I entered legitimately the United States, that been in school and did everything that I have done. And that thankfully, thanks to that, is what has allowed me to finish off my degree, working and paying my education, and built my career both in entertainment and, of course, in politics, which I am currently doing. But of course, that's just the summarized version of the story right now, for the sake of time. But passing the baton to you, Dr. Giovanni, with regards to the hurricanes, for example, in Central America, most of the time they come from the Pacific Ocean. And why suddenly there has been this sort of spike in Caribbean hurricanes leading up to the current century?
Thanks, Guillermo. Yeah, it's tempting to think that it seems like there are more hurricanes, but really what observations have been showing us over the last 20 years is not necessarily an increase in the number of hurricanes in either the Atlantic or the Pacific, but there has been an increase in the number of stronger hurricanes that, we used to go several seasons without seeing a Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane, but now we're starting to see them almost every year, sometimes more than one. In the Pacific, they are called typhoons, especially over in the Western Pacific, like the Philippines and Japan, but they are the exact same type of storm, in the Atlantic. But yeah, because the oceans absorb the vast majority of extra heat that all that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is trapping, the oceans are getting warmer, and warmer waters are the engine for hurricanes. So warmer waters evaporate more easily. More water vapor in the atmosphere leads to these low pressure systems that can turn into these massive storms. So we are not seeing more hurricanes in a given year, but we are definitely seeing more stronger hurricanes. And that, of course, is going to lead to all kinds of ramifications when you start adding in all of the other consequences of climate change.
Thank you. And considering the warming of oceans and, of course, the worsening of the climate crisis, how many people can we predict to be displaced by such things, such as rising waters, droughts, flooding, and other increasingly worsening natural disasters?
Yeah, so it turns out there's a lot of uncertainty in that because of sort of the difference between sudden onset events like a given storm, or an earthquake, versus sort of the slow motion events, if you will, of drought, increasing drought, which might take decades to manifest, or sudden increases in, well, not sudden, but gradual increases in precipitation. So you have maybe a few million people might get displaced by one given storm, but when you start to add up the increasing migration due to drought, increased flooding, which all puts stress on food supply, which water supply, estimates can range. As I was researching this, I was kind of shocked to see it can be from 25 million people to up to 1 billion people affected by 2050 in terms of having to move due to climate-related events. But it seems like there's sort of a vague consensus on an estimate of somewhere in like the 200 million range, which is still an incredibly large number. And to say that all of those people are going to have to move because sea levels are rising or increased flooding, it's really difficult to say that, but we have been able to see over the last few decades that more people are having to leave their homes, where they're from, due to increased stresses added to whatever humanitarian crises there may be based on climate change. So drought, food insecurity, all of that is going to just stress whatever other problems were in the region. So it is an enormous problem that I'm glad why we're doing this kind of town hall, because it definitely doesn't get enough notice, I think.
Most definitely, and particularly that we also suffer our own natural disasters here within the U.S. I mean, thinking about how this is affecting us, or even interstate migration, when we have things that have happened, such as Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, Hurricane Maria a few years ago, or even most recently, those devastating tornadoes out in Tennessee.
That's right. 40% of the U.S. population lives in a coastal county. So even if we're out here out west, we tend not to think of ourselves as subject to hurricanes, but of course we live in earthquake country, right? And any coastal area is going to be subject to sea level rise. And with the more sort of worst case scenario path that we are on for this given century, I mean, we are looking at, a foot or more of sea level rise by the end of the century, which seems far off until you realize like, oh, that is only 80 years away. And our children who are alive now will probably still be alive then. So, everyone is going to be affected by this in one way or another.
Thank you, Doctor. And now switching gears just a little bit into the immigration aspect of this. For you, Ms. Menendez, for example, those that were not really aware of how sort of the process works. For example, for people that are forced to flee their country due to climate-related activities, how does the current legal process look like?
So unfortunately, it's an easy answer because there isn't a process for people fleeing due to climate-related activities. I believe we're not unique, as in the United States is not unique in not recognizing that as a basis for asylum. I don't think any country, if I'm not mistaken, currently recognizes climate refugees, though Giovanni had mentioned many of these climate changes that we're seeing are really the foundation for some of the other conflicts that force people out, right? So just very quickly, the way that asylum works in the United States is you have to have suffered persecution, so that right there be confronting you in some way. And it has to be based on one of 5 recognized bases, right? So it has to either be based on your race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or particular social group. Particular social group is that catch-all. Us immigration attorneys crazy most of the time, because you have to find a recognized group under which this person falls, right? And simply saying, I cannot live in my country, there is no food because, all these natural disasters have taken place. We simply don't recognize that. Unless there is a human being on the other end that's actively persecuting you, there currently is no social group that we could fit those people into. So a person fleeing their country due to a climate situation would have to find another reason upon which to base their asylum claim, if that makes sense.
I gotcha. Thank you. Now, switching within like those same, I guess, status requests, when it comes to TPS, for those, especially for those that don't know in the audience, what is the TPS exactly, and is it an effective legal process for even climate-related immigration?
So yeah, I mean that's been the way that many people have found a way to stay, right? So TPS is temporary protected status, and it's the United States government recognizes certain situations that don't fall into asylum that might prevent someone from being able to go home. So that doesn't just include natural disasters and climate situations, but that also could be conflicts like combat. So you're not going to force someone to go back to a war zone, for example. In my opinion, TPS is not actually effective because right in the title it says temporary. Many of these climate events El Salvador, who's to say that they're going to be able to return in a year and a half? What are they returning to? Even if things are operating on a quote unquote normal level, there's still going to be so much that person cannot return to. Correct. So the way TPS has worked now, and many people, as you know, have had it now for over 2 decades. And now the government jumps in to say, hey, this was always meant to be temporary. Meanwhile, these people have built a life here, right? So it's just not adequate to really address the way people live, the way people settle. So unless there's a path in which people who are able to get TPS status, unless there's a path for them to eventually be able to stay here permanently, it's just really ineffective.
Gotcha, thank you. And now, considering the current state of the United States immigration system, how do you think the government can better aid immigrants facing refuge caused by climate change?
I think that's going to take a really big shift in the way we think about ourselves and our place in the world. As Dr. Giovanni was also mentioning, and right now towards nationalism definitely doesn't help. Like where I feel, this pandemic should bring out this awareness of how we are interconnected, right? And the things that affect China are going to affect Europe, are going to affect the Americas, are going to affect Africa. It's all there. However, we do see that so many people still aren't on board with that idea, right? Even though it's unavoidable. So the United States, so many things about it. The immigration system have to change, and that's just one big one because these changes are going to continue and they're going to get worse. So we definitely have to address them. But I think that's more a political question.
the state level, with the summers and droughts worsening here out west, how much can this affect the lives of our fellow Nevadans?
Hi, and thanks for having this important conversation. It's difficult to quantify what the effect of climate change will be either seasonally or yearly, but we know that the effects are real and that they are widespread. So it's difficult to answer your question with specific data, but what we know is that we need to be prepared for our weather patterns to change, for days to get hotter, for different changes in not only our weather, but in the way that affects how our days operate. So does that mean that work starts earlier or later? So the ripple effects of climate change, not only on our seasons, but on our economy, are really important for us to analyze and be able to not only mitigate through policy making, but also to change our state's policies and response to accordingly.
Thank you. And with regards to refugees, what sort of aid is available for refugees here in Nevada?
For all refugees? Difference. Climate refugees are not a recognized group, as Martha just talked about. Refugees themselves have different nonprofits that offer refugee assistance. So which one are you speaking to?
For in general.
So if a person is a refugee and is resettled in the state of Nevada, there are a number of nonprofits, though in my opinion not enough, that can help with resettlement, that help do the work to ensure that there's everything from community access and connections to education assistance. But our refugee policy has changed pretty dramatically under the Trump administration, and less people, despite the dire circumstances they face at home, are being allowed refugee status. So many of the groups that used to help large amounts of people in the state are now seeing fewer people and fewer clients that they can assist.
Thank you. And now a question, the both of you are free to answer in any order, of course. With regards to possible future legislation when it comes to recognizing climate migrants or just climate migration, both interstate and from internationally, how is that sort of looking like in the future legislative session?
Well, immigration issues are almost entirely, so it's difficult for us at the state level to create anything that is migration related without having action on the federal government to either complement it or amplify it. What we can do as a state is continue to enact smart climate change policy that allows us to meet the way that climate change is affecting our state and our earth. We can also do the work to push our federal delegation and Congress generally to enact policies that recognize that climate refugees are have just as valid claims to refugee status as do other refugees, and continue to define the different layers of climate change's effects, including but not limited to people losing the very lands that they have in some cases been on for generations of families. So we can do our best to be creative in recognizing climate refugees at the state level, but we wouldn't be able to enact policies that grant refugee status, for example, because that's largely designated at the federal level. And I know Assemblyman Flores is on, and he is much more well-versed in immigration law and its intersection with state policy than I am. So I think he may have a better answer than I do.
Thank you, Senator Cancela. The only thing I would add, and the intersectionality of what state and national law can do is, number one, we have to start by recognizing that there is a climate crisis at the federal level. And I think we still don't have that consensus. But more importantly, recognizing it is just the beginning. I think the U.S. has a responsibility to ensure that we spearhead the demand that we have international law, that we have a binding convention, and that the U.S. spearhead it. And by doing that, we create an actual climate refugee, a climate immigrant migrant definition. And then once we create a definition, we can start tracking actual data. Where are folk moving from? Why are they moving from location A to location B? What particular regions of the country? And then once we have that, we can do something similar to what we do with asylum law. We could have folk apply for that type of status. So similar to how somebody would say, well, I am an asylee, and here, let me explain why I qualify for asylum under U.S. law. We would do the same thing and create a climate refugee definition and allow people and create an enumerated number of folk that could apply annually. We set a framework to applying for that. You could do it through the regulatory body, and or you could, if necessary, go to immigration court, as you would do now at times with asylum law. And then the other thing is, I think we could mimic some of the stuff that we see with special immigrant juvenile status. So right now, if you are a minor and you are in the U.S. and you have a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident who can take you and protect you because either you've been abandoned and or abused in a different country, you would go to a regular family court, and then the family court would make a special finding. You take that special finding and then you send it over with a whole host of other evidence to the USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and you apply for this special status called SIJ. I think we can mimic that and say, look, we have minors, because I think we've seen this, and anybody who's involved in this conversation, we've seen this very particular thing where maybe I, as an adult who is in my 20s or 30s or 40s, who lives in a particular region in the country, I can maybe sustain the weather, I can maybe sustain having to work there, or there may be options for me as an adult, but maybe a minor, a very small child, that is an unsuitable place for that child to be raised. And maybe that child, we could make the argument that following that special SIJ model, saying, look, it is in the best interest of that child for them to live with their uncle in the US, and we would create that regulatory framework. Right now, we don't have any of that. And that's where the state intersectionality that Senator Cancela mentioned would come into play, because it would involve the state courts interacting and playing with the federal law to make it all work.
Thank you so much, Assemblyman. And that's all the main questions that I have. I believe this goes back to Brianna, who's going to open the floor to our audience.
Yeah, I don't have any questions from the audience at the moment, but if you have to the speakers that you'd like to address or bring up a past point, feel free to do so.
Definitely, thank you. For you, Dr. Giovanni, for example, what else can you tell us on your expertise when it comes to these changes due to climate change at the state level?
Yeah, so what we can expect is more of what we've been experiencing, right? We've been in a drought for a few decades now, and that is projected to continue. The Southwest will continue to get drier, experience more, hotter more days of sort of extreme heat. And you can then just imagine what are the impacts of that. Of course, water is the number one. And we don't live here certainly in Las Vegas, but really in a large part of the Southwest without the Colorado River. So all of the politics, of course, are myriad around that. But, thinking of how not that Nevada has a lot of farming, but what farming we do have in ranching, for example, how is that going to be impacted as the drought continues? What does that mean for the natural desert environment, of which, we have quite varied elevations in Nevada. So the environments are really sensitive to changes, both human cause and then natural cause. So, saying, everything is connected. And of course, that's one thing I focus on in my classes is, by studying the natural world, we see the interconnections of how literally everything is connected. And the challenge is to remember that we are part of the natural world and everything we do affects the environment, and then the environment's responses affect us. So, of course, Nevadans are really good at being water conscious, but that has to expand into, thinking about where our food comes from. It's not that we have a whole lot of locally grown food, but what we do, trying to consume more of that as opposed to relying on foods that have to come from far away. And then energy consumption. We do live in one of the sunniest spots in the country. So, maybe pushing for more. I know, of course, we passed it was question 6 last time, right? The increase of more having 50% of our power generated by renewables by 2030. So now that's great. Let's keep pushing towards 100%, because anything we can do to get off of fossil fuels for our energy sources and then eventually transportation, all of that helps the problem.
Thank you. Another question for you when it comes to geographical changes. As we see the sea levels rise, how would you sort of describe a sea level rise gradually in the next few decades?
So we tend to think of it's not really that big a deal until sea levels rise 12 feet, right? Which would drown the major cities of the world. But we don't need that extreme of sea level rise to see changes. Miami floods pretty much on a daily basis. Okay, sure, the streets are not covered in water, but their underground infrastructure is regularly flooded. The mayor of Miami understands what climate change is, though the governor of Florida, maybe not so much. So anywhere that's along, or near or at sea level, it may not be that your houses are flooding regularly, but anytime there's a storm, that little bit of extra water is going to get pushed that little bit further on land, right? And can cause more devastation. So especially think of the eastern seaboard where a lot of the coastline is basically at sea level. And then you add a big Category 5 hurricane. Yes, we are going to see more and more people affected by that. Another thing people don't often think about with sea level rise is as sea levels do rise, that salt water does encroach inland into underground aquifers. And underground aquifers is where the vast majority of humanity's freshwater supply comes from. So there are island nations in the Pacific that are having to basically leave their entire islands not because they're underwater, but because their underground aquifers have been contaminated with salt water and they don't have a drinking supply anymore. So countries like the Maldives, Kiribati, Tuvalu, other South Pacific island nations, they've been screaming about climate change for 50 years because they have already been affected by it for decades. So sea level rise doesn't have to necessarily be visible to our eye for it to already be having a major impact.
Gotcha. Thank you, Doctor. Now, this one is directed towards anyone in our panelists. What does the internal displacement for Americans look like in case they need to move to other cities or states? How do we address that? Anyone?
Well, I might take a stab at it. You're certainly going to see displacement towards places that may have more water, maybe more food, but you're also going to see food production itself shifting because, for example, the great breadbasket of America, the Midwest, Nebraska, Kansas, those are areas that actually don't get enough rain for the kinds of crops that they grow. They are rapidly depleting the underground aquifers. So we may start to see areas where food is grown actually shifting. So then what are the consequences of that? The people are going to have to follow that. So that's my contribution to that answer. I'll let others chime in.
Thoughts on it, Assemblyman, Senator? Ms. Menendez? Okay. Let's see. Now, going back to a more legal question now. Where we see most climate refugees coming from? What area of the world is being impacted the most right now?
Can you hear me? I'm not sure if my mic is working.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Unfortunately, that's a question again I can't really answer, because when I meet my clients, they aren't they're, while there might be environmental situations that push them here, that's not how we refer to them, because that's not really what we're looking at. So I think it's really hard to know. Also, some people, like I said before, that are fleeing certain conflicts, are the conflict might be the final push to get them out their country, right? But it started possibly decades ago with a drought that led, to internal conflicts that later led to their persecution, which later led them to fleeing. So it's really hard to estimate. I imagine. I know when the Syria conflict began, there was a lot of discussion on what had caused it, right, initially, and a lot of it went back to a situation like that. It was a drought, though now we don't think of it that way. And most people wouldn't, when they think Syria, they don't think environmental issues, right? So it's really, as Dr. Giovanni was saying, these things are happening at different rates in different areas, and I think maybe that I don't even know that the United States government is tracking that kind of information within our orders, because again, we don't recognize these things, or we don't want to recognize these things on a federal level, right? So it just would be very difficult to say which regions are more impacted, and how many refugees we're seeing, and actually start monitoring it in any meaningful way. It's just going to be a very difficult number to get to.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in at the end there, the other problem is everything is regional. So the U.S., we're going to see environmental disasters, and regionally, folk that can easily access the U.S. And when I say easily access, I still mean very treacherous terrain and very difficult ability to access it. But I mean it's easier for them than somebody who, say, is in Africa or Asia. And I just make that point because the only real number we could look at to try to identify what folk we have here for environmental disasters is TPS. And even that is very politically charged, because it's up to the acting secretary to choose and decide whether or not we're going to deem a certain region a environmental disaster, and whether or not we're going to renew that every 2 years or every year, or whatever the process is. So unfortunately, we have no real data, no real number. Unless we create like a law where we mandate that we do that, we're not going to really know how horrible this is impacting humans across the entire country and the world.
And if I could jump in just to follow up on that, what often gets lost as well in the discussion of climate change and all of these environmental issues is, of course, that it disproportionately affects people of color, poor people, and so as we're seeing with the pandemic, right, it is not evenly spread, the consequences, and that is so often overlooked. It has been for decades, and so keeping that in mind too, how do you develop a political solution to the fact that the people who are going to need the most help not to have a voice, and if they do, it's a quiet voice. So it's so multifaceted that you're right. How do you respond to it regionally? It's literally a global problem. It can't be dealt with piecemeal.
Thank you. Now, considering climate being as sort of recognized as an issue, what can we as Nevadans do to elevate this so we can recognize climate refugees or climate change as a metric, measure policy, and of course the environment itself, to better the lives of our fellow Americans and of course citizens in the world? Anyone?
I think honestly, it all goes back to that reframing, right? We just have to change the way we think. We are so focused on our own borders and keeping everything in here, and this nationalism that's rising. It just curtails any of that conversation. We can't even get to that point until we really get people to understand how interconnected everything is. How, like, if you don't take care of this now, it will come to you. You don't have to come to it. So I think as Nevadans, I think I'm not local. I've only been here 3 years, and I've lived in a bunch of other parts. And I feel like Nevada is very good at environmental issues, from my perspective. So I think we're very well positioned to start that conversation if needed, to push that conversation. I mean, I'd be happy to hear others' thoughts on that, since I'm not yet, a long-term Nevadan.
I'll just jump in and say I'm a almost 7-year Nevadan now, but I am from California originally. And I would say, maybe to your point, Nevada is actually well placed because we do, make decisions based on science. So that, I think, will help us continue to, make progress in that. But it also means influencing our neighbors and federal leadership as a whole.
Thank you. Now, considering the past few crises that we have faced, as a nation, for example, Katrina for fellow Louisianans or Maria for fellow Puerto Ricans, how have we as Nevadans sort of responded to assist or to host our fellow Americans that have been displaced by these disasters? Anybody?
Sorry, I was trying to get my mic to work. Again, I'm always super impressed with Nevadans and how I see things mobilizing. Maybe it's just the kind of work I do and the people that I surround myself with, but I do see us, with the situation in Puerto Rico. I know a ton of people that have been working on that issue. I hear about it all the time from my local organizations. I'm super proud of Nevada. I'm super proud to live here because of that. I think we're so very involved, but as Dr. Giovanni said, we really need to start pushing that activism out to our neighbors. People really have to understand. So again, like I was talking about this nationalism where we just see the United States as like a little bubble that's not affected. I think that happens with states too, right? Puerto Rico sees for us that we're not, we're like, oh, how sad, that really sucks for them, but we don't really see them as part of us, as part of our community, as people we need to stand by when things like this happen, and how can we support them. So I think it's again, it all comes down to shifting our mindset and helping others shift their mindset as well.
Well, the only thing I'll add is, I know sometimes it's easy for state level to punt everything off to our federal delegation, and some of it is kind of reframing how we approach legislation, and a lot of it is us staying in our lane too, right? Because we do have a federal delegation who are our partners and we work with, and I think are doing an astounding job for our state. And sometimes I know that they're in an uphill battle trying to get our national federal delegation on point with them. But I do think at a minimum, we as a state sometimes take a proactive approach to kind of lead by example. I think we've seen a lot of movements where they spread into separate states, and that it starts really from the bottom up for some of these more complicated conversations. And I think this is true, and I hope Senator Cancela agrees with me on this. A lot of what we see at the federal level, where everybody's kind of sticking their heels into the ground and not working with each other, that's not necessarily true in Nevada. I know that we have a lot of folks that we can work across with, to have very genuine and strong positive conversations for all Nevadans. And I say that because at a minimum, if we recognize that there is a climate crisis and that there are folk here for disasters are having to be displaced from their home, and we recognize that a lot of these folk may not see their families again. A lot of them have no clue where their families are. A lot of them had to suffer through a drought and maybe witness families members pass away because they didn't have the essential needs taken care of. It could incredibly difficult because it always turns into a money conversation to see if we can ever do more to help. Senator Cancela mentioned this early on, that we have very few organizations that are strictly focused on helping our refugees. I know Catholic Charities we work very closely with, who do amazing work. Northern Nevada has their folk as well. But, you know, it's always a resource game. The wraparound services that are necessary to allow somebody who had to leave everything behind and start over here, from language barriers to job training to acculturating to a whole new system, to how to navigate what is very new and complex. I remember I who wrote an article once for UNLV many years ago, and he told me that the first time he came to the U.S., he cried because he saw electrical sliding doors at a store. He had never seen that in his life, and he was so overwhelmed by that. That was like what the thing that crumbled everything he understood. Right? He's like, look, I was used to struggling. I was used to fighting every day in my life for food, and then he says, I come to this country, and I see the luxury of not having to extend a finger to open a door. He says, I was overwhelmed. I could not believe that this existed. So imagine that human being, and then multiplying that times 1,000, which is what we get here in Nevada, I think, a year. We have to provide more wraparound services, and as a state, we could get involved with that. But Senator Cancela, who understands money much better than I do, can talk about how complex. Anytime we talk about a single dime being spent in addition to what we're already spending now, how difficult of a conversation it is to navigate that.
Any thoughts from anybody else before we move to our last question that we have? Okay, and a last question, sort of picking up from understanding what are the policy with it, you know, that doesn't cost us a financial argument. What sort of wish list items do you have for like a Nevada level type of action to address these issues both within our state borders and considering our partners abroad?
So I'll jump in. My wish list is I want to see the asylum process completely gutted and redone in this country and redefined. I think there's a tendency, especially in the last 3 years, to very much narrow who fits into these categories and who becomes eligible. I think we need to actually expand it. Again, I know that's a politically very, 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 very difficult thing to do, but if we're talking wish list, that's what I want to see. I want to see a recognition of environmental factors being brought into that conversation. And I really want to see a different approach within the immigration court system and the immigration services in general. As Assemblyman Flores was speaking to this gentleman who arrived, or this person who arrived and saw these doors opening, right? I don't think we, and if you read some of these opinions coming out of immigration judges, the things they say, I don't think there's a recognition of that, right? Of the mind shift, the difference in in how we live as opposed to other places. Some of my clients, and I work with children mostly, they didn't know borders existed until they tried to leave and come here. Like, they just had no idea. They could leave their very rural town and show up somewhere else where they would be safe. It just doesn't occur to them that they can't move somewhere where they're not going to face death. And so it's mind-blowing, and I think mind and see different perspectives. But I think we really, really just not. And if this pandemic doesn't show that to us, I really don't know what will.
My wish list is also incredibly broad. Listen to the science. More civic engagement and more critical thinking, but listen to the experts.
Senator, Assemblyman, any last thoughts with regards to that wish list? Thank you so much. And thank you so much for all your great insight, and we'll be handing it off to Brianna.
We want to thank our speakers and viewers for taking your time out of the day to listen to activists, community leaders, and elected officials to discuss climate migration, their stories, and their roles upon this issue in our community. This conversation was pertinent to the myriad of issues concerning climate migration and our current political climate. We hope everyone is staying safe during this time, and thank you for tuning in once again.